The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task.
Good morning. Hope you are enjoying a beautiful Sunday. So thankful that you're here with us this morning and very appreciative of your attendance. We're looking at 1 Timothy chapter 3, and we're going to be looking at verses 1 through 7 as we continue our journey through 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And this is one passage that is absolutely critical to the Lord's church. We're looking at the qualifications for those who are overseeing the congregation. In 1881, there was an elder that stood before the congregation, and as he stood before the congregation to give his resignation for his position as an elder, it's reported that he said, "I must resign from the greatest position in all the land in order to become the President of the United States." James A. Garfield, the 20th President of our United States. And you read this passage that Zach just read for us. The saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. There is no greater position in all of creation. There is no greater responsibility in all of God's creation than what we are about to read. Even President of the United States. We ought, we ought to be training young men to be overseers. It would be great if they're lawyers or doctors or fill in the blank with whatever it is, but that is nothing. The greatest, the greatest thing that they can be for God is an elder in the Lord's church. A noble task indeed. As we move through this text, and that's exactly what we're going to do, verse by verse, we're going to see the positives, we're going to see the negatives, we're going to see the qualifications in the light of the household, how he takes care of his household, in regard to strangers and outsiders, and in regards to their own spiritual life. That's the direction in which we are headed. And there's a lot to cover, and there's really no good way to attack and to conquer this particular passage rather than just methodically moving through it, because every single one of these things that we're talking about is essential in regards to the qualifications for an elder, overseer, pastor. Let me say this at the beginning: I am not a pastor. The way that the world has come to use the term pastor is abusive. I am not it. All I am is a preacher working for the pastors, just like y'all are. Let's look at some of these positive, positive qualities that this the pastors are supposed to have. We see these in verse 2. Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, sober minded, self controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. There it is, the positive qualifications of what is going to require for someone to shepherd God's people. First of all, that they're supposed to be above reproach. Now, that does not mean that someone, in order to be an elder, someone is supposed to be perfect. No, none of us are perfect. That is not what it can mean at all. That wouldn't make a lick of sense. Above reproach, above or not having any indictable character flaw, which someone can say so and so is not qualified to teach because, for instance, he's a hothead or he is addicted to fill in the blank, whatever it is. No indictable character flaw that would disqualify one from being an elder. The next one that you see is that he is a husband of one wife, or literally, the translation would be a one woman man. He's a one woman man. In order to be a shepherd, an elder, a pastor, they got to be married. They got to be married to one woman. And we can take that, and there's been a lot of discussions, but what it literally says is a one woman man in order to be qualified for this position. They must be, as the ESV reads, sober minded. The connotation here is obviously, when we think about someone being sober, there's an association with drinking, with alcohol, with intoxication, right? As it is in the original language. There's this association, close association with being given to wine. And we'll talk about that when we get to verse 3. But we're talking about someone that is clear-headed. They're a straight thinker. Someone that is sober-minded. They aren't controlled by other things that are in their mind. They are sober minded, making correct decisions, unguided by biases and other things that our mind might be controlled by. They are respectable. I like the way the American Standard translates this as orderly. They're orderly, respectable. The root of this particular word is the same as world, cosmos. Where we get our transliteration of the word is cosmos, the universe, right? And in the universe, when you look at the world, when you look at the universe, when you look at the things that God has created, there is an order to it. An elder, in a respectable way, has to have his or life in order. In a spiritual sense, it needs to be in order. In a physical sense, it needs to be in order. In a mental, emotional sense, his life needs to be a life in order, a respectable life. When you can look at him as an example, respectable. You see here that the one that we skipped over is self-controlled. There is a close association between being sober-minded and having self-control. In the root, it shares with wisdom, Sophia, wisdom. So to be self-controlled in one sense is to be wise. Now, when we think about self-control, a lot of times we think of someone who is able to hold themselves back from whatever it is, that they are able to restrain themselves. And in a similar sense, that is what it is to be wise, isn't it? To be able to control yourself. An elder is not to be impulsive. They're not supposed to be someone that is driven and controlled by self, by their own impulsive desires and instincts, much like an animal would be. They're supposed to be able to control themselves. Then, of course, someone is supposed to be hospitable. If they're desiring to be an elder, they're supposed to be hospitable. When you think about this particular characteristic, it obviously makes sense, doesn't it? If someone walks through these doors, obviously, and the elder, the leader in this particular congregation, gives them a cold shoulder or asks them, "What are you doing here? How'd you find us?" That doesn't really give off a good vibe, does it? Obviously, many times we're talking about being hospitable in the home, aren't we? An elder is supposed to be someone that is welcoming in their own personal life. Intrinsic in the idea of being hospitable is not judgmental. You think about the most hospitable person that's ever lived, and he didn't even have a home. In fact, the most hospitable person that ever lived said, "Foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head." Isn't that interesting? Hospitality isn't just for the home, but it's a state of mind, a state of welcoming, encouraging, making someone feel like they belong. One of the qualifications for the elder. And the last one here in verse 2 that we see in the positive light is that they are supposed to be able to teach. Now, that doesn't mean, as some would have you believe, that doesn't mean, and nor does it ever say, that the elder is supposed to be teaching all the time. Nor does it say that the elder is supposed to be the one in charge of the Bible classes. I'm not sure that they had Bible classes back then. But the elder, the pastor, is supposed to be someone that is able to teach. Now, the question is, what are they supposed to be able to teach? The Bible doesn't give us an answer, does it? Simply that they are able, they're capable, they have it within themselves to teach. Obviously, if you want to follow somebody and you're entrusting your soul to that person to get to heaven, they ought to be teaching you, able to teach. Look at the negative aspects of this, and there's a lot to cover. So we're drinking from a fire hydrant, I suppose. So just open your mouth and swallow every once in a while. The negative aspects, as you move into verse 3, we've got 4 of them here. Let's read it together. They're supposed to be able to teach, not a drunkard, not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. In order to be an elder in the Lord's church, these are the negative qualifications. You are not supposed to do these things. You are not supposed to be, first of all, you are not supposed to be a drunkard. That's the way that the ESV translates this. The word is a combination between para alongside and oinos, the word that is used for wine. So someone is not supposed to be alongside, beside wine. I think one translation translates this as someone is not supposed to linger over wine. They're not supposed to be a partner with wine. There is a sense in which this word, as we come into the first century, has lost its connotation with wine. And some translations, I believe it's the American Standard, translates this as a brawler. Obviously, when somebody gets drunk, they can become a little irritable, we might say. Not a brawler, not a drunkard. The only other time that this particular word is used is in Paul's letter to Titus. And guess what? It's in the same list of the qualifications of an elder. They're not supposed to be someone that tarries along beside wine. Fairly interesting. The next one that you read with me is that they are not supposed to be violent, but gentle. They're not supposed to be violent, but they are rather to be gentle. Now, this is the only one in verse 3 as you're reading it that has a counterpart. Not violent. Rather than being violent, they're supposed to be gentle. It's interesting. If you turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 1, that this is one of the qualities that Jesus possesses, is gentle. And perhaps we're more familiar with what he says in Matthew chapter 11. Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden. I am gentle and lowly in heart. The way that the elder is supposed to deal with the sheep is gently, not violently, but gently, just like Jesus. Now, that means that there are some things in the Bible that are black and white, that require a firm and strong hand. Just as a shepherd, what does he carry? Right? We're very well aware that he carries this hook, right? And sometimes it is necessary for the shepherd to wrap that hook around the sheep and to drag him back to the flock. There are other times when a simple nudge does the exact same job. Gentle, just like Jesus. Not violent, not quarrelsome. As the elder, and you can only imagine, there are things. Let me say this. As a matter of job security, we've got 3 great elders. Wonderful elders. They deal with things constantly. And the reason they deal with things constantly is because we're not good. We're not good. We've got problems. We've just got problems. People have problems. Just like sheep, sometimes we really stink. And as they deal with those particular problems, the elder doesn't need to be one who is always trying to pick a fight, do they? They don't always need to be the one that is in the middle with the accusations and the charges. Why are you like that? They deal with heated situations, hot topics. And the elder, the pastor, does not need to be a hothead. I was reading one commentary, and this particular commentator said that he knew of an elder one time that had an obnoxious member in his congregation. Okay. An obnoxious member in the congregation who this particular elder challenged to fight in the parking lot. Sometimes one of the elders may feel like fighting us in the parking lot. But that's not the way to deal with the situation. Not violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome. And this last one that you see in verse 3 is that they are not supposed to be a lover of money. Now, we know that if we just flip over just a couple of chapters, we arrive in chapter 6. And in chapter 6, we see in verse 10 what? Very important concept that the love of money is the root of all kinds, all sorts, all evil. Well, it's no wonder that we read in verse 3 that the elder, the overseer, the bishop, the pastor is not supposed to be a lover of money. After all, as they deal with the money, they need to understand it's not my money, it's God's money. The elders are not supposed to be loving money. They're not supposed to be hoarding money, gathering money. Let's see how much we can get. No, it's God's money to spend in God's way. One extreme example, if you'll allow me to share with you, is a man by the name of Floyd Shod. Floyd Shod. And perhaps you remember, I've told you about him before, but he was the man that dealt with the money, whatever you want to call him, in a congregation where there were no elders in Missouri, Monette, Missouri. Floyd Shod. He believed that it was his responsibility to make sure that every single penny was gone from the bank account because he knew that it wasn't his money, it was God's money. They're not supposed to be a drunkard, violent, but gentle, not quarrelsome, and not a lover of money. And then we arrive in verse 4 and verse 5, where we see the qualifications, the testing ground, if you will, in this household of the elder. Read it with me. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. For if someone does not know how to manage his own household, how will he care for God's church? If you can't even care for the members in your own house, how in the world could you possibly care for God's people? If you can't care for your own people. A few points worth noting here. 2 times in these 2 verses, you're going to notice the word, as if you're reading along in the ESV, manage. Translated different ways and in different translations, but manage. And we don't like to think about elders as managers, but in a very real sense, they need to be good managers. Managing, caring for, taking care of God's people. Especially when we think about their own household, they need to be taking care of their house, tending to, making sure that they are provided for, all of their needs are met. You also see one of the qualifications is this idea of dignity. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. What does it mean to be dignified? What does it mean to have and to hold dignity? Someone could command you, I want you to obey me. But that's not necessarily dignified, is it? And on the other end of the spectrum, someone may come up to you and to say something along the lines of, hey, buddy, I really wish that you would listen to me every once in a while. There's not really much dignity in that either. Rather, dignity is somewhere in the middle. Not a stern, aggressive command of obedience or submission, and not a passive command of obedience, but rather a natural respect that one has, a dignified. Have you ever, and it's happened to me a handful of times, known somebody that when they walk into the room, all eyes are on them. Like they just command that sort of they have that presence about them where they just are dignified, man or woman, dignity. It's one of the qualifications of an elder. And of course, this idea where we have spent hundreds and thousands of hours talking about what does it mean in verse 4. He must manage his own household well with all dignity, keeping his children submissive. What in the world does that mean? His children are supposed to be submissive, but for how long are his children supposed to be submissive? One of the qualifications that we read about later on is, as Paul writes to Timothy, is that his children, the elder's children, or Titus, his children are supposed to be believers. They're supposed to have the faith. Well, what does that mean? For how long are his children supposed to be submissive to him? And the answer is as long as they're supposed to be submissive. How long are his children supposed to be submissive to him? As long as they're supposed to. Not in perpetuity. That wouldn't make any sense. That would be contrary to many things that we read in the Bible. That, for instance, that when a man loves a woman, they are to cling to one another as they get married, and they're to leave father and mother. There is no submission to follow after that. Just as an example. So, how long are they supposed to be submissive to their father? As long as they're supposed to be submissive. There's not an age limit, nor is there a moment in life when they are no longer allowed to be or permitted to be submissive. But I will tell you that if verse 4 and verse 5 are met, these qualities, they will always be respected by their children. They will always be honored by their children. Look at verse 6. Here we see their spiritual life. We see the way in which they are spiritually mature, or their maturity here. Read it with me. He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up with conceit and fall into the condemnation of the devil. He is supposed to be spiritually mature. Now, as Paul is writing to this particular man, Timothy, he is at Ephesus. And in Ephesus, the congregation there has existed for a little over 10 years. So, what does it mean that this person must not be a recent convert? Sometimes we like to put a number on that, but we can't, can we? It would be hard to do, especially in a congregation that's only existed for less than 15 years. But we do know the qualification is that he must not be puffed up, or literally, he must not be beclouded, surrounded with the clouds. He must not have his head in the clouds above everybody else, puffed up, arrogant, chest out. I'm superior. Not like the Gentiles who lord it over those that are under their control. When that man is puffed up and his head is in the cloud, and when he is surrounded, great will be his fall. The bigger they are, the harder they fall. Don't be conceited, arrogant. Have you ever worked with somebody that was arrogant? Have you ever worked with somebody that said, I've been doing this. I know I just follow me because I'm more or less, I'm better than you. It's hard to follow somebody like that, isn't it? An elder is not to be conceited or puffed up. They're not supposed to be a recent convert, lest they become puffed up. And then there's a connection between verse 7 and verse 6. We'll talk about it in just a minute, but look at verse 7. They are, as we look at their relationship with the outsiders. Moreover, he must be well thought of by outsiders, so that he may not fall into disgrace, into a snare of the devil. The connection between verse 6 and verse 7 is the snare of the devil. In verse 6, it says, into the condemnation of the devil. In verse 7, it says, into a snare of the devil. The devil wants you. The devil wants me, but especially the devil wants the elders, the leaders. Let's bring down the leaders. Then we bring down the church. Well thought of by outsiders. A synonym for disgrace is reproach. Reproach. Now that brings us back to where we began, doesn't it? One of the elders, they need to be above, verse 2, above reproach. They must not have disgrace found in them, lest they fall into the snare of the devil. You see, when an elder falls into the trap, into the snare of the devil, or the condemnation of the devil, the elder, obviously, the elder is hurt because the devil has him. The church is hurt because their leader is caught by Satan. But perhaps the most important idea is that God is hurt. Now allow me, as we put a pretty bow on this, allow me to make some obvious applications. We've been talking about elders, shepherds, pastors, overseers, but hopefully we're talking about ourselves. Verse 2. Therefore, a Christian must be above reproach, husband of one wife, sober-minded, self-controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. Aren't those things that we ought to strive for? Verse 3, not a drunkard. Christians don't need to be a drunkard. Not violent, but gentle. Not quarrelsome, not a lover of money. If I could summarize verse 4 and verse 5, your house needs to be in order if you're a Christian. As a good example for the world. If I could summarize verse 7, your light needs to shine, and your light needs to shine bright if you're a Christian. You see, as I'm reading, as I'm studying verses 1 through 7, I see things and qualities over and over and over again that every single Christian needs to strive for. And if we all strive for that, what a wonderful place God's church would be if we all strive for these qualities. I don't know where you're at in your life, but I do know this, that there are shepherds at this particular congregation that care for you, that care for your soul. Paul, my other brother Paul, Larry, they all want you to go to heaven. That's their goal. If you're not on your way to heaven, why not? Get in the straight and the narrow path. Give your life to Jesus in baptism. Start living for Him.